Good morning or good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our last session of the day. Our first speaker up for the Species of Interest session is Christine Delamour with the National Geographic. Christine, let me give you presenter privileges so you can share your screen. Okay, I'm sending that to you now. And you have the floor whenever you're ready.
Great, thanks, Karen. Okay, can everybody see?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So thank you so much for inviting me to speak today. I'm getting over a little bit of a cold, so hopefully my voice doesn't deter anyone from understanding me. I wanted to talk today about one of my favorite subjects, which is underdog animals. In my work as an editor at Nat Geo, I try a lot to focus on animals that tend to be ignored by the public and conservation experts. So you might not see a lot of presentations start out with a photo of corpse-eating beetles, but that's why I put these on my presentation. You might actually know about this animal. It's the American burying beetle. It's considered critically endangered by the IUCN, and it used to roam across the United States. It's now limited to just six populations, and one of them is in Oklahoma. It's very important for recycling corpses of small animals and helping keep the ecosystem healthy. Before I move on, I wanted to say that the photos in this presentation will be mostly taken by Joel Sartori. He's a National Geographic photographer who I work with occasionally, and he's also interested in highlighting these animals that we don't often hear about for his projects. So first of all, a day in the life, because I often get questions, what's it like to work at Nat Geo? Do you wear flip-flops all day? Do you go to Papua New Guinea every week? The answer is it kind of depends. In normal times, I would attend a meeting in the morning and we would determine what kind of subjects we're going to cover that day on our website. Most of my job is working for the website, doing editing and writing for the animals section. But I do some writing for the magazine as well. And I've been fortunate enough to travel a great deal with Nat Geo to all 7 continents, actually. So here are some photos from some of my reporting experiences abroad. And back to business. So what I'm going to talk about is a conservation dilemma that some of you may be familiar with, namely that there's a limited pot of money for conservation, and a lot of that money goes to what we call celebrity species. So the lions, the tigers, the apes, the animals that are considered, interesting to look at, cute, popular, etc., to the detriment of some lesser known animals, like this eye on the left here, which is an animal endemic to Madagascar. It's considered an evil omen, actually, by some people who live there because of its spindly fingers that it uses to extract bugs from trees. As I said, a lot of the decisions are made for conservation based on whether an animal is cute, fuzzy, or popular. It's not always the most rational use of funds, however. Tigers, for example, are among the most, they get the most funding of any species. And India, for example, spends a lot of money on tigers, and they're still endangered. So that raises the question, should we be reprioritizing how we allocate conservation funds? I wanted to bring to your attention some animals that Joel Sartori has highlighted in his photo arc project. The Javan slow loris is a very shy nocturnal creature found in Indonesia. The addax is an antelope in the Sahara. There's fewer than 200 individuals remaining. The northern bald ibis is regionally extinct in Europe. It's found only in Morocco and Iraq, and it also, I think, is down to 250 or less. The Philippine crocodile is also extremely endangered, limited to just a few populations in the Philippines. One of the problems with conservation is if an animal doesn't have a face or a species doesn't have a face, it tends to be ignored. This is the bunched Cory cactus. It is a threatened species in the state of Texas, and it gets about $140,000 of funding from various government agencies each year. If it got more funding, according to experts I've interviewed, it could be brought back from the brink with just a few tens of thousands of dollars more. And that is because, unlike a lot of mammals, plants are relatively easy to raise in captivity and then repopulate in the environment. You'll often hear conservation groups talk about something called the umbrella effect. The idea that if you save a tiger or a lion, all of those lovely impacts will trickle down and help the little guys. Well, this is a very charismatic species called India's purple frog. Called the purple frog, which lives in India's Western Ghats. However, it has different needs than the tiger does. It needs fast-flowing streams to reproduce, which is not a requirement for the tiger to survive. So it might not have the same conservation needs as the tiger and might not be protected in the same way. So it shows that there's some holes in that theory. Solutions, there are many. Many conservationists try to apply a decision-making mathematical approach that's based purely on economics. One approach that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has used is called the knapsack problem. So it's the idea that if you're going on a hike and you have a backpack or knapsack, you have a limited amount of space. So you try to fit as much as you can in a smart way. The same idea applies to conservation, looking at this dilemma. If you have a limited amount of money, how many species can you fit into your backpack and save purely based on the economics? There's also the idea of conservation triage. It's very controversial that you need to let some species go to save others. I'm sure many of you know that the California condor was on the brink of extinction in the 90s, and there were some conservationists who discussed this idea. Should we bring, I think it was down to 20 animals. Should we bring those animals into captivity and breed them, or should we let the species go? Obviously, they decided to preserve the animals and bring them into captivity, and nowadays they're recovering the species. But it is something that is discussed from time to time. There's also the idea of conserving what's called edge species. So the most evolutionarily unique or the last of their kind. So the II that I showed you a few slides ago is an example of an animal that's the last of its kind. It doesn't have a lot of close relatives. So losing it would be losing an entire branch of its family tree. Here are a few more charismatic animals, some of my favorites here. The tree kangaroo is native to Papua New Guinea. It's endangered due to deforestation mostly. It's also bushmeat, also eaten for bushmeat. The flat-headed cat is a particularly interesting small feline. It lives in Southeast Asia's wetlands, and the wetlands there are being destroyed at a rate at which the cats are declining quickly, and it is endangered species as well. What's interesting about small felines, which is something I've written about many times, is they're nocturnal, they're shy, and they look a lot like our house cats. So conservationists tend to ignore them. There's at least 30 species of these little cats living on most continents, and they tend to be ignored in favor of, leopards and cheetahs and larger cats. And then the pangolin. There's actually 8 species of pangolin in Asia and Africa. This is the Sunda pangolin of Southeast Asia. And as you probably have heard, pangolins are very much sought after for their scales and are arguably the most trafficked animal in the world, illegally trafficked. So one of the things that comes up when you talk about how to save these lesser known species is the Cinderella species concept. So these are animals that scientific research has found will generate public interest. That's based on survey data or interviewing people in various places. And scientists argue that there's a lot of untapped potential in elevating these animals' profiles. For example, this okapi, which is a giraffe relative that lives in the Congo Basin. If conservationists were to generate a campaign around this species, say in South Africa or other parts of the continent, they might be able to drum up more support for an animal that most people don't know, and therefore elevate its profile and that of other species living in its ecosystem. There's also the little brown moths. Most of you who are birders have probably heard of the little brown birds. Well, there's a lot of moths that are small and nondescript, such as this creature. And this is an article I wrote in February. It's related to Joel Sartori's PhotoArc project, which I've mentioned. He photographed this moth in September 2020 near Santa Fe on the Pecos River of New Mexico. And when he took the photo, he sent it to a moth expert and he essentially said, "What is this thing?" And the moth expert wrote back and said, "I've been waiting for this photograph for 130 years. It had been identified sometime in the 1800s, but no one had seen this animal alive before then." So that just goes to show you how little studied these creatures are and how often ignored they are, even by scientists. One of the other benefits of looking at these little understood creatures is that some of them are in our own backyards. And that's something that Joel Sartori discovered recently during the pandemic, when he's reconfigured his focus to be on invertebrates and animals around him. I'm going to show a little clip about some of his work looking at invertebrates in Nebraska, which is his home state.
So I'm Joel Sartori with National Geographic PhotoArc. Can't go anywhere because of the pandemic, so we're doing insects this summer, starting as soon as it warmed up in May, all the way till frost, really. Lots and lots of insects, hundreds of species, because invertebrates help make the world go around, and we haven't gotten too many of them in the PhotoArc till this summer. So we're trying to do what we can during the pandemic to find a silver lining. My daughter Ellen's been helping me also, which is really nice. Tonight we're at Indian Cave State Park in Nebraska, and it is a fabulous place, like many Nebraska state parks, for insect diversity. No chemical use here, no agriculture here. It's just big rolling river bluffs along the Missouri River. And we've set up our sheets with our big lights. We're going to fire up the generators and we'll see what we get. So our process here is we string out white sheets on the ground and on light stands. And then when it gets dark enough, any minute now, we'll fire up portable generators and we'll run these 250 watt bulbs, and we'll run them for a couple, 3 hours, and we'll see what comes in. And if something new comes in, great. We'll catch that, put it in a cup, photograph it, and let it go. And to date, we've probably got about 500 species just since May. And it's late August now. So we're rolling along. We'll get as much as we can here in Nebraska until frost comes sometime in October. I've been looking.
So that gives you an idea of the focus that Joel Sartori is starting to embrace on invertebrates. To close out my presentation, I wanted to emphasize that it's okay to love pandas. It's okay to love tigers. I just feel strongly that we should look at these little known creatures and learn how to conserve them as well. And this, the topic that I talked about today was also published in May in National Geographic magazine as an essay, and you can read it online at this link. So thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Christine. If you would like, you might check your chat box. I don't see anything just yet in the chat box, but we can check back a little later too.
Okay. Let's see.
Did you have any chats in your chat box? Nope, not yet. Okay.
Not yet.
Okay, we'll check back and we'll watch on our end also. And if there's anyone calling in, you might want to just go ahead and send me an email with your question and I'll be happy to forward it to the presenters. So we'll move on to our next presenter, Dieter Rudolph with the Department of Agriculture. I believe I have given you presenter privileges, so you can start sharing your screen.
Okay, hello everyone. Here we go. Okay, so my name is Dieter Rudolph with Oklahoma Forestry Services, and I am our forest health specialist and our forest stewardship coordinator, which basically means I run a lot of the programs that get assistance out to landowners. One of our bread and butter is technical assistance and writing stewardship plans, management plans, something like that. And what we'll a lot of times do is we'll go out and visit landowners. We'll kind of walk their property with them and get an idea of what they have. And after talking with them, what they want, and we'll help them kind of bridge the gap from point A to point B, give them some of the tools for how to get to the forest that they really want in the future. Some of the other programs that Oklahoma Forestry Services offers is also urban forestry, where we do a lot of the same stuff, except instead of on private landowners with communities, they might have some public green space, they might have some parks, things like that. We also do a lot with water quality, where we work with people, especially loggers, to protect our water resources, and then fire protection, which is both prevention and suppression. A lot of fuel mitigation to try and reduce the risk of wildfires, as well as if they do happen, reduce the impact on the ecosystem. And just like the previous two that I described that I do, a lot of that is done with on-the-ground technical assistance, some on-the-ground management techniques that we'll help with, and that kind of stuff. So I got into forestry because growing up, I was big in the Boy Scouts. I like to camp, I like to be outside, and I found out that I could make a career of that. And that's kind of what got me started. But what really kept me going was, instead of I get to spend all my time in the woods alone, I started spending more time with landowners. I started hearing their stories and kind of getting their passion as well. And one of the biggest things that I've always found that landowners, their main goal is to leave the land in a better condition for their children or for any generations that follow. And I really have taken that to heart. That's become one of my goals. You see a picture of my two girls enjoying the forest. I don't think they'll ever become foresters, but I know that they'll always have a special spot for nature. And that makes me proud. That's kind of my goal in life. So we're here really to talk about invasive species right now. So what is an invasive species? There's a lot of different definitions. They vary a little bit here and there, a couple keywords, but for the most part, an invasive species is non-native to the ecosystem under consideration and whose introduction causes or is likely to cause economic or environmental harm or harm to human health. So basically, they're species that don't belong in the ecosystem and they're going to cause some harm. And here are a lot of common characteristics of invasive species. They're usually quick to grow and fast to mature, which means they're going to put out seeds pretty quickly. And when they do seed, they create a whole bunch of seeds. They're very successful at spreading those seeds, whether it's through wind, through animals, through water, and then those seeds have a high rate of germination. So they're basically able to take over just really quickly and grow really fast. And then not only that, but they've got rapid spread through their roots. A lot of invasive species will send up root sprouts or stump sprouts. And that's basically the trees, the roots are underground, they're moving. A lot of them have kind of shallow roots, and they'll send up a sprout from each root. That will send up a stem. That stem will establish itself, and then that stem will produce more roots, which then it just keeps going that way. So now you're getting trees that are invasive plants that are spreading not just from their seeds, but then also just from the roots themselves, and they're able to really quickly take over that way. And because of that, they're able to outcompete a lot of the native vegetation. And then what is common with them is they are hard to remove. It usually has a high resource cost to remove them. So why is this a problem? So this is a property in Oklahoma City. It went more or less unmanaged since the 90s, and it became a problem. So you see on the left, you've got the overstory trees, mostly oaks. This was taken in February, so they're still in leaf off. But everything that's green is privet, Chinese privet. And it has just spread throughout the property. This is about 10, 20 acres, and I would estimate that at the time that this photo was taken, 15 of those acres were privet alone. It created a thicket. Looking out, it's hard to see anything, so you lose the aesthetic quality of the forest. It's basically a wall. It's hard to walk into it, so you lose a lot of the recreational parts of the forest. We'll get into some of the other aspects in just a second. The other photo is a picture of me next to an ailanthus, or a tree of heaven. Now, this stand, I showed you this picture, was taken in February. In early March, it was cleared off. It was cut down to the ground. This ailanthus has grown about 12 feet in those 4 months. This second picture was taken in June. So that's what I was talking about before, that they are fast to grow and fast to reach maturity. That tree is going to be in the overstory in a year or two. Meanwhile, all the native stuff that are around my knees, that's all black locust. It doesn't have the growth to keep up with it. There's no way that it's going to be able to compete for sunlight. So I showed you the picture of the privet from the outside. This is inside the privet. I'll get this video started. And that's my one of my foresters, Riley, stating the obvious. The stand inside of it is just privet. There's nothing else. So now we talked about how you don't want to really go through it for recreation purposes, but we also see there's really no benefit to wildlife. Charismatic megafauna like deer, they're not going to want to walk through it. It's too thick. Smaller animals might see cover in it. It's good cover from birds of prey. Birds will go into it because it's a thicket, so it's good protection. But you see there's no forbs, there's no grasses, there's no flowers underneath it. There's just nothing for them other than that cover. So there's a lot of better ways to mimic that cover while we also address a lot of the other wildlife species habitats. So I'm going to focus mainly on privet. The main reason I like to focus on privet on invasive species talks is because there's a lot of different management options for invasive species, and just about every one of them will work for privet, depending on how much you have and how established it is. So privet, here's a couple key characteristics for identifying it. The only ones I really want to focus on right now is that it's evergreen and that it's thicket forming. We saw the thicket, you don't want to walk through it. It's hard to get in to manage it. And it's evergreen. It's going to keep its leaves even when the native hardwoods have lost them. Here are a couple of the management options for invasive species for privet. We'll go into each one in detail, but it's poling, mechanical removal, herbicide treatments, and then biomechanical and fire. So poling is kind of the first one. You could do this if you've got an early population of privet, because remember I talked about how the invasive species have those root systems that keep sending up sprouts and establishing more roots. The older the organism is, the harder it is to do this, just because the roots are so established. For slightly bigger, you could use something called a weed wrench, which is basically just a giant metal pole that you use as fulcrum and lever. It's heavy to carry through the woods, and it's not exactly something you want to bring into a dense stand. So it's only for early infestations where you could get ahead of it, which, as far as invasive species go, the best time to do it, if you catch it early, you're going to save yourself a lot of time and a lot of resources. But most people don't really realize they have a problem until it's a significant problem, and then it's usually too early for this method. So next is mechanical removal. Here's a mulcher. This is that same stand. And as you can see, it's literally just going in and it's just taking down everything that's above the ground. Now this works great in the sense that it managed a large population of privet in a fairly short amount of time. It had quick results. That top left photo is that same area I showed you at the beginning that was just a wall of privet. Now you can actually see through it. You can see the trees. Now, some of the issues with it is it's very cost prohibitive. A lot of people don't have this heavy equipment at their easy disposal. And so you have to find someone who's able to do it. And you want to find someone who is skilled enough to do it because there's a lot of hidden things in that privet stand. There's a lot of trees that were left over. You don't want to hurt them because they're your seed production. They're what you're going to be trying to use for reforesting with the native hardwood species. And then the other issue is it doesn't kill the roots. So this bottom right is what happened 4 months later. Now, a lot of that growth is good. There's some greenbrier there, which is great for wildlife. There's some forbs, some grasses, some flowering species. But then among all of it is privet. And it's just all coming back. And that's because the mechanical removal managed what's above the ground, but it didn't kill the roots. And now the roots get that response that something happened to the above ground portion, and it's just going to be sending up new sprouts like no other. Here's the ailanthus again. That was also once again removed, and it sent up sprouts. On the other side is more privet. That one's about waist high. Once again, the same area. There's just nothing else that could grow there. The roots responded so quickly that there's new growth. You're not going to get that forbs and grasses and native oak regeneration or native hardwood regeneration because that privet just choked it out. There's no way the sun could get down to it. And so that's become an issue. But now instead of having a stand that's 30 feet tall, you have a stand that's 3 feet tall, and that becomes a lot easier to manage. So there are benefits to doing this large scale removal and then coming back and addressing the small regeneration as opposed to the established tall trees. So next we're going to talk about some herbicides. Here's a good chart that I found from out of Mississippi State that has a list of basically all the chemicals that work for privet. Now I will say when I hear from extension offices, a lot of times glyphosate and triclopyr are the main ones they recommend. And then when I talk with land managers who are doing the work out in the field, but are not necessarily associated with the university, they usually say 2,4-D. So those are all really going to work well. I do want to point out that a couple of them, the imazapyr and the metsulfuron, as well as the hexazinone, those are all soil active, which means you have to be careful with them in a stand like I was showing you because you want to protect the hardwoods, but you want to kill the privet. Now, both of those are broadleaf plants, so the herbicide is going to treat them the same way. If you have a soil active herbicide, you'll kill the privet, but you run the risk of hitting the species you're trying to protect. So if you have a mixed stand like that, I wouldn't recommend using those just because of their soil activity. With herbicide, there's a bunch of different options. The first one is foliar, where you basically just spray the leaves. Now, in this case, you don't want to soak it till they're literally dripping. You just want to get it wet, but you do need to cover most of the crown. And that becomes an issue with the one stand I showed you at the beginning, because since it's so dense, you can only get the outer edges of the stand. But remember that after the mechanical removal and we saw the 3-foot tall privet, now you could able to walk through that and you could do a foliar application on that, spray all that down because you could reach it all. And the way the foliar herbicides work is the leaves are, photosynthesizing. They're sending the energy they produce down through the stem, down into the roots, while the chemicals go in with the leaves and kind of tags along with that. So you're bringing the herbicide down to the roots to help kill them, to prevent, or rather just reduce the amount of resprouting that it does. The next one is a basal bark treatment. It works in a similar method where you're translocating the chemicals down into the roots, but in this one, you're spraying the bottom about 1 foot to 20 inches of the stump. And this works with thin bark species, so that thin bark, it's allowing the chemicals to move into it and moves it down. With privet, this is sometimes difficult since it's a multi-stem species. It's hard to get in there and treat all the stems. With the tree of heaven, this is a great practice because they're usually single stems. They're fairly large, so it's harder to remove, and it doesn't injure the tree. And why I say that it doesn't injure the tree is that injury, if you were to make a cut, is what kind of triggers the roots to send up more sprouts. So just painting it with this herbicide doesn't trigger the resprouting as much as some of the other treatments do. It does, basal bark treatments do leave standing snags, which is not always the most aesthetically pleasing. If you're working in your back 40, this might not be an issue. The snags will fall down on their own and they'll take care of themselves. But if you're working on something that's like in your yard or highly visible, this isn't always the best option if that aesthetics is important to you. Now, cut stump is, it's like the mechanical removal in the sense that it has a high cost of resources, but in this time, it's more of your resource of time rather than money. And that's where the practice where you take a chainsaw, you go through and you just cut everything down and then you paint it. If it's a small stem, you're able to just do the whole cut surface. If it's larger, just the outer inch with an herbicide. And even though the stem has been cut, it's still going to be drawing that liquid down into the roots for a little bit. Now, if you wait too long, if you wait a day or so, one, you're going to not be able to find what stumps you cut. And two, it's already going to start sealing itself off, so it's not going to translocate that chemical as well. So you want to paint it immediately. Now, this is going to give you some of the quickest results. You'll be able to see what you did that day as opposed to the foliar or basal bark where you're going to have to wait for the chemicals to take effect. And then the last option is hack and squirt. I'm really just including this because it's another way of killing trees you don't want. It's not the best for invasive species. For privet, the stems are usually too small that you'll end up just cutting it off. But the goal with hack and squirt is you either girdle it or partially girdle it where you're making a cut all around or around most of the outer stem. And then you spray that with paint or with, not paint, with herbicide, brings it down once again, kills the roots. And that girdling also stops the translocation of nutrients up above. So you're effectively killing the stem as well as bringing chemicals down to kill the roots. The issue with this with a lot of invasive species, though, is because you're making that wound, you're triggering the resprouting. And if you're going to be doing that, you might as well go either don't injure it and do the basal bark treatment or just go the rest of the way and cut it all down. So for the most part, I don't recommend this for most invasive species. And the last method is biomechanical and fire. And biomechanical is really just a fancy way of saying you're sending out goats or something else to browse. This isn't going to work with a very established dense stand because the fire is not going to carry well through a privet thicket because it holds a lot of moisture in. You need to have a fire on a really dry day, and at that point, you're running the risk of also hurting the trees you're trying to protect. And then the goats aren't going to really work too well on that established stand because they just simply can't reach the leaves. And goats will eat just about anything that's green. But where this is great practice for is the return. You know, each time you manage for an invasive species, you're going to have those resprouts. Even if you kill the roots, you're going to have resprouts because there's the seeds present. There's some parts of the roots that will just survive. But now if you run a fire through it regularly or you run goats through, they're going to be taking care of all those knee-high resprouts. And so at that point, you're going to be able to kind of manage what's trying to reestablish itself and just kind of keep the status quo at that point. There's different ways you could do fire to protect the species you want, depending on how often you set a fire. You could protect some of those oaks you want. With goats, if you're going to want to protect some other species, you might have to put up some fencing around any native regeneration you're finding just to protect that, because once again, goats will eat anything that's green. But those are both options. At the moment, there's not a whole lot of research behind it. So we do want more research. They're still looking into it to find the full long-term effects. We know that it works for a couple of years, but other than that, the research is just too new. And then the last thing I want to talk about is kind of upcoming technology. And so drones. And I'm not saying drones, put the drones with a herbicide applicator or with a chainsaw. I don't think we're there yet, and that idea kind of scares me a little bit. But what drones are great for is mapping out where you have these infestations. there's a lot of stuff coming in. There's a lot of new sensors with drones. The one that I'm looking forward to using is it basically measures the level of greenness of a tree. And all trees, they've got their color specific to the species. Now, to our eyes, it's going to look green. It might look dark green or light green. But to these NDVI sensors, they're able to put basically a metric to it. And if you have a reference point saying, you know, I know this one here was privet, I know this one's oak, you're now able to kind of get that range of, well, privet is this level of green. And as a result, now you run a drone over it, you run the sensor, and you have a quick map made to show you exactly where you have the problems and where you have good native regeneration. And that's really important because that's going to help you plan in the future what techniques you want to do, where you might want to start to focus, where you want to just kind of monitor to keep it from establishing itself, as opposed to where you need to go to really remove the problem. One of the biggest takeaways I want to say with any invasive species management is it could get overwhelming. It could seem daunting. The worse a infestation is, the harder it's going to be to remove. Biggest tip is to just take it one step at a time. You want to pick your priority area. Say you have 100 acres of forest. Pick the 5 acres you want to start in. Clear that one year. Go the next year, clear another 5 acres. But each year, always return to the previous treated areas, because you want to make sure you stop anything from reestablishing itself. You want to maintain what work you did while taking little bites of the big chunk overall. So here's a couple additional resources. The 2 books, The Invasive Plants in Southern Forests and a Management Guide to Invasive Plants in Southern Forests, are both put out by the U.S. Forest Service. They're PDFs available online. They're great resources. The one is great for identifying the species. It'll give you kind of all the key characteristics of it, as well as what the current distribution is. The other is going to give you, about half the book is in-depth information on what we talked about today of what to do for invasive species, and the other half is species specific. They'll have about a page or 2 on each individual one. That'll kind of give you a rundown of what you want to do if you have Ailanthus or tree or privet or anything like that. And then that last website, the Southern Forest Health, it's put on by by the southern states. There's 13 states, including Texas, Oklahoma, and Louisiana. And so it's going to address a lot of the issues that are in that southern region. Those of you who are in New Mexico, it might not be as applicable, or a lot of these invasive species might not have reached you yet, but it's still a good resource. It's not just plants, it's also diseases and insects, and it's got a whole bunch of fact sheets associated with each one. So it's a great resource if you have a problem and you want to just read up further on it. And then lastly, here's all the websites for all of the state agencies for Oklahoma, Texas, Louisiana, and New Mexico. We all have forestry programs. We all have very similar programs. We do everything a little bit differently, but the goal is still to help landowners, providing technical assistance and all that. That if you have questions, concerns about your land, I urge you to reach out to your forestry service and schedule a visit with them or talk with them on the phone, because it's a wealth of knowledge that's all there just to help you. And with that, that's done with my presentation. If anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to address them.
Thank you. You might want to check your chat box and see if you have any questions in there. I don't see any on this end just yet. Nope. Okay. Well, we can go back to that here in just a little bit. So we'll move on to our next presenter. Thank you, Dieter. Okay, Virginia. Our next presenter is Virginia Seamster with the New Mexico Department of Game and Fish. And I have given you presenter privileges, Virginia. And we're starting to see your content.
Great. So you guys can see the slides?
Yes, I can see your PowerPoint now.
Awesome. And I just put 2 links in the chat One is to the Share with Wildlife website, and Share with Wildlife is a grant program I'm going to be talking about for most of the presentation. And then the second one is for the Biota Information System of New Mexico, which is the second resource I'm going to mention at the end of the presentation. And I want to say how much I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you all today, and how much I appreciate the time of everyone who has joined the session and is sticking around for the last presentation in this session. So I'm Jenny Seamster. I'm with New Mexico Department of Game and Fish. I do have a split position. I mentioned previously I coordinate the Share with Wildlife program, which I'll emphasize in this talk. And then at the very end, I'll talk about the Biota Information System of New Mexico, or BISONM, which is just a huge database of species in New Mexico. So Share with Wildlife is a grant program that's been around since the early 80s. We fund projects in 4 different categories focused on wildlife: habitat enhancement, research, education, and rehabilitation are our 4 focal project types. And the focus of the program has always been on supporting work for species that don't receive funding from other sources. And so I really appreciated Christine's remarks earlier in the session about the importance of the understudied, underappreciated species, because these are a lot of the species that Share with Wildlife tends to focus on. Since 2005, which is when the first version of the State Wildlife Action Plan for New Mexico was released, our focus for Share with Wildlife has largely been on species of greatest conservation need as identified in that state plan. Share with Wildlife is a donation-based program. We have several different funding streams, but the biggest one at the moment are these 4 different license plates that we have available through New Mexico's Motor Vehicle Division. We've been releasing a new plate roughly every other year since I've been with New Mexico Game and Fish, which is 6 years now. The last 2 plates that we've released have our state fish, the Rio Grande cutthroat trout, and then the state bird, the greater roadrunner. We maximize the donations that we receive by matching them against state wildlife grant funds, which we qualify for those funds from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service because we have that state wildlife action plan that I mentioned previously. The program budget is $200,000 a year at the moment, and we do cap the per project dollar amount at $50,000. That helps us maximize the number of projects that we're able to put on the ground. Just to give you a snapshot of what we've done over the past 10 years, we've supported just under 90 projects, averaging about 14 projects a year. And in that 10-year timeframe, we've distributed just under $2 million to 50 different contractors. We can contract with both public and private entities. We work with all different kinds of universities, for-profit and nonprofit entities, and then all levels of government. I did a very quick search, so this is not intended to be comprehensive, but I just wanted to get a better feeling for projects that we had done specifically with tribal entities or on tribal lands. Unfortunately, at this point, I only found 2 that fell in those categories. One from the early 90s with the Pueblo of Zuni, focused on surveys for the Zuni bluehead sucker. And then one from 2010 with grave area surveys that were done on Santo Domingo tribal lands. So all of that to say, Share with Wildlife has a lot of room for growth, I think, when it comes to partnering with different tribal entities. And I would really love to see us expand our work with tribes, especially if we can find points of common interest and common species that we all want to do more work for. And the graph at the bottom of the slide just shows the breakout between those 4 project categories that I mentioned. As you can see, a lot of the funding that we invest in projects goes to research. Annually, we do support some education and rehabilitation projects, just usually at smaller dollar amounts than the research projects. And then we've been working hard to expand our support of habitat work. That $50,000 cap that I mentioned is the main limitation when it comes to doing habitat work, since those are on average more expensive projects. Share with Wildlife has a lot of different goals. I just want to talk about one overarching goal. Since there are 235 species of greatest conservation need in New Mexico, there's a number of different reasons that species are on that list in our state wildlife action plan. They have a number of different information and conservation related needs. And one of the things that I see Share with Wildlife needing to do and should be aiming to do is help species move along this trajectory shown by the arrow I've got at the bottom of the slide. So a lot of our species of greatest conservation need have major data gaps. Share with Wildlife, especially the research projects, can help to fill in those information gaps. We can help move species to the point where we know enough about them and we know exactly what we need to do to try to help them on the ground, be it habitat restoration work, protecting particular areas that they really need for different parts of their life history. And ultimately, I think the goal should be that we do enough and we understand the species well enough that they no longer need to be considered species of greatest conservation need anymore. This is by no means a comprehensive series of pictures. It's just to give a sense that Share with Wildlife has supported projects dealing with a great diversity of different species just in the past few years. And these are not even all of the species that we've worked with since I've been on staff for the last 6 years. And basically what I want to do for the rest of the presentation, I want to go through several example projects just to give a sense of the breadth of the projects that Share with Wildlife supports. I chose species from different taxonomic groups, species that have been surveyed all over New Mexico. All these different colored areas on this map in New Mexico show the distribution of the areas where fieldwork was done for these different species that I want to focus on. And I also tried to choose species that are found in different habitat types. So the first species I want to talk about, the Penobscot least chipmunk. You may be familiar. It's a very rare, very narrowly distributed species found only in the northern part of the Sacramento Mountains in southeastern New Mexico. It is under review and should be coming up for proposal by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for listing as an endangered species. That listing should be out this year. And at this point, there's a lot of things that we still don't know about the species. And given the process that Fish and Wildlife Service was going through to list the species, it was a really critical time frame in which to learn as much as we possibly could. So we enlisted the help of New Mexico State University and a private contractor over the course of 4 different years to do a lot of different surveys for this species. And I do want to give a big thank you to members of the Mescalero Apache tribe. They facilitated access to some of the key survey sites for this project. And so really that assistance was essential for key aspects of this work. There were 3 main things that the researchers with New Mexico State and private contractor were focusing on. They wanted to see where the species was found because good surveys for the species hadn't been done since 2000. They wanted to learn as much as possible about the ecology and the life history of the species, focusing on habitat associations and activity patterns. So they used a number of different techniques. They did do live trapping. The species is really only found in pretty high elevation, cold alpine areas. So given the challenges of doing surveys in these habitats, the researchers developed less invasive techniques and they deployed camera traps. And they were able to develop a technique to separate and differentiate photos of the Penasquilles chipmunk from other species that are found in the same areas. And using camera traps allowed them to collect so much more data and get really good information on the distribution and habitat associations of this species. For the live trapping that they did put or they used radio telemetry with 16 individual chipmunks to get much more detailed information on habitat associations and on home ranges for those 16 individuals. And they focused in on, last year, they focused in on the largest known population of the species. They did an estimate of the population size, which their estimate was 44 individuals. They found that the species has a very low reproductive rate based on photographs that they took of juvenile chipmunks, and they found that their activity patterns are limited. They're less active when it gets really hot and when it's really dry. So as the climate changes, that will become increasingly challenging for this particular species. And there's still a lot to learn, but these 4 years really helped nail down a lot of good information about this species. Second project I want to talk about was with Eastern New Mexico University. They were focused on 3 years of work with the Western River Cooter, which is a species of turtle found only in the Pecos River drainage in southeastern New Mexico and going over into Texas. And they focused on especially tributaries to the Pecos River. For this project, the researchers used hoop net traps. They captured several hundred turtles. For the larger turtles, they marked them uniquely, either with pit tags or by markings on their shells. For younger turtles, they were again able to use photograph identification techniques to uniquely identify juvenile turtles, which greatly increased the amount of data that they were getting on the turtle populations that they were surveying. They did find live turtles in a county where live turtles had not been detected before for this species, so that was very exciting for this project. They worked with another Share with Wildlife contractor, the Desert Willow Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, to take x-rays of almost 300 turtles. From the x-rays, they were able to determine that there were 6 individuals that had ingested fish hooks, because there is fishing in some of the areas where they were doing surveys. And there was even evidence of, I think, 1 individual that had been shot at. They, from the x-rays, were also able to look at things like clutch size, egg size, when females were most likely to be ready to leave the river. And up top here, we've got a picture from the Black River, which was one of their focal tributaries. Leave the river and go out and make a nest and deposit eggs. And they also confirmed that turtles were able to have multiple clutches of eggs in 1 year. Next project I want to talk about deals with 3 species of fish. We were working with a private entity, Turner Ranch Properties, and then with the National Genomic Center Lab with U.S. Forest Service. And these focal species are found in northern and southern New Mexico for the Rio Grande chub and sucker, and then only in 1 drainage in southwestern New Mexico for the Chihuahua chub. And the focus of this project is really to make it possible to use environmental DNA techniques to survey for these 3 species of fish. You may be familiar with these techniques, but basically the idea is that as a fish moves through the water, it sloughs off cells, it deposits fecal material, and if you filter a bunch of water, then those cells and fecal material will end up in the filter. And then if you extract all the genetic material that was caught in the filter, you can learn a lot about what species are present, not only right where you took that filtered water sample, but upstream. And the amount that you can learn about things upstream depends on the type of environment and how the water flows and things like that. But it can go several hundred meters upstream that you're getting a snapshot of what species are present in that segment of stream. And at this point, they've developed the lab techniques necessary to identify whether these 3 focal species are present in an area where you collect a water sample for 3 of the species. They're still doing testing for one of the 3 species. And one of the 2 things that they look for when they're testing out these lab techniques, they want to make sure that they're getting the right species and that it can differentiate between the species you're interested in and closely related species. They also want to make sure that when they know a species is present based on other survey techniques, that the technique detects that focal species. They're going to be collecting a lot of water samples in either later this year or in spring of 2022. They're going to finish testing that 3rd marker or 3rd lab technique. And they're going to be assessing the distribution of these 3 focal species in 3 rivers, 2 in northern New Mexico and 1 in southwestern New Mexico. Next project I want to talk about deals with 2 species of songbirds. Surveys were done both in northern and southern New Mexico, and the focal species are the graces and red-faced warblers, and we worked with a consulting firm in Albuquerque. So these 2 species are found either in mixed conifer forests or in ponderosa pine forests. And the survey techniques were doing point counts. The survey locations were in 6 national forests in New Mexico. When combining the point count data with GIS data on distribution of suitable habitat across those national forests, the consulting firm was able to determine both the density and then the abundance of each of the focal bird species within each national forest. They also recorded data on, I believe, over 100 other bird species during their point counts. So with further resources and further time, we could potentially get information on a large number of other species as well. The last research project I want to talk about deals with 12 terrestrial snails in southwestern New Mexico. The contractor that we're working with is coming over from Arizona to do these surveys. And these species are all very narrowly distributed and haven't been surveyed for since either the late 1990s or early 2000s. And these are pictures of some of the habitat types that these narrowly distributed terrestrial snails are found in. It's typically pretty rugged, pretty remote mountain ranges, and especially talus slopes, and more specifically the bases of talus slopes where there's more water that's accumulated and it's wetter for the snails. One of the first things that the contractor did was to gather all the historical data that he could find. He's gathered over 900 historical records, which in and of itself is a very valuable outcome from this project. He's been doing visual encounter surveys, flipping over cover objects, sifting through little bits of soil and leaf litter, and finding and counting snails, both shells and then live snails. And at this point, he's surveyed over 70 different sites. He's found 10 of the 12 focal species that he's looking for. He's going to do some more surveys later on this year. And he's been marking down potential threats to species. And at this point, catastrophic wildfire is one of the biggest threats that he's identified. I do want to talk about 3 education and rehabilitation related projects quickly. The education projects, one is from northern New Mexico, one is from southern, and then there's 3 rehabilitation centers that I'll mention that we've worked with. So for education projects, we worked with RiverSource, which is based out of Santa Fe, New Mexico, in northern New Mexico. They work with students all over northern New Mexico. Their focus of their if their environmental education program is on water quality monitoring and assessing the health of riparian areas. And they get students out in the field collecting both chemical and biological information on water quality and then the health of riparian areas. Obviously, the focus of Share with Wildlife is on wildlife, so they've also been integrating more wildlife monitoring. They have students record all wildlife sign, including scat and tracks that they see when on field trips. And they also set out camera traps and have students identify the photos to see what other species are using the riparian areas. And they have students, at least a subset of the students that they work with, write papers about species of greatest conservation need. During COVID, since they weren't able to work with students directly, they produced several videos related to riparian areas and their importance for wildlife. And those are publicly accessible from their website. And in their field excursions, they've worked with a number of different schools, but that includes students from the Pueblo of Cochiti, Santa Fe Indian School, and then the Pueblo of Jemez. Asombro Institute for Science Education is the other education project I want to mention. They work with students in southern New Mexico in the Las Cruces area, and they've developed new classroom and field-based activities focused on wildlife and one or more species of greatest conservation need. For classroom activities, they have students learn about food webs. They have students participate in management action planning and develop a draft management action plan for the gray vireo, which is one of our bird species of greatest conservation need. For field activities, they have students evaluate whether key elements of black-tailed prairie dog habitat are present at their field site, and then they have them think through what could be done to improve the habitat to benefit this species. As I mentioned, we have done work with 3 different wildlife rehabilitation centers over the past 6 years, one of which is the Desert Willow Wildlife Rehabilitation Center in Carlsbad, which took all those x-rays of Western River cooters for the researchers at Eastern New Mexico University. We've got one center in northern New Mexico, one in central New Mexico in Albuquerque, and then Desert Willow, which is in southern New Mexico. All of these centers are engaged in both rehabilitation and educational activities. For rehabilitation, they're taking in between 500 and 2,000 sick and injured animals every year. Those animals are brought to the centers by members of the public, our conservation officers with New Mexico Game and Fish, and other entities. And they do as much as they can to help heal those animals and release them back to the wild. They also, for their education side of things, they do a lot to answer questions about wildlife and encourage behaviors that help people coexist with the wildlife that they find in their neighborhoods and backyards. That's all I have for Share with Wildlife. The last 3 slides just deal with the Biota Information System of New Mexico, or BISONM, which I mentioned is basically just a huge database. And I only mention it in case it's a useful resource for anyone in the session. We've got over 6,000 species accounts in BISONM. These species accounts contain information on species biology and ecology. These items in bold are what we emphasize when we're doing data entry, because BISONM is very much a living database. And I always welcome, any submissions of information that we're missing in BISONM, especially focused on information related to New Mexico. But we highlight changes in taxonomy, changes in legal status, including whether a species is listed at the state or federal level. And then we also try to keep the distribution information pretty up to date. But as it's available and as we're able to, we do try to put in information on all these other aspects of species biology and ecology. BISONM is a really great starting point if you want to learn more about a species. We do have a list of references for every species account, and the more recently added references, we hyperlink directly to PDFs. So it's a great place to start if you want to dig into information on a particular species. This is just a screenshot of one of the many thousands of species accounts in Bison M. This is the broad-tailed hummingbird. If you were on the site on this particular species account page, and if you clicked on any of these blue bars, then you'd get more information on the species, you know, its taxonomy, legal status, distribution, and so on. And this is just what the homepage for Bison M looks like. There's 4 different types of searches that you can do. Species search is where you'd go if you have a specific species you're interested in, or a group of species. Let's say you're interested in all birds that eat insects and are found in a particular habitat type. You could do a search to get a list of those species. For county reports, this gives you a list of species found in a particular county in New Mexico. Document search allows you to dig in more on those references that I mentioned that are associated with species accounts. And then last but not least, contract search. If you want to learn more about previously funded Share with Wildlife projects, that's a great place to start because we are trying to put as many reports from previously funded Share with Wildlife projects in this contract search as we can, and we will keep populating it as we fund more projects. I'm happy to take any questions now, or if you ever want to reach out via email. I love talking about Share with Wildlife and Bison M and other informational sources that we have in the department related to conservation. And I so very much appreciate everyone's time today and the opportunity to talk with you all.
Thank you, Jenny. I put a question in your chat box from one of the attendees.
Okay. Yes, so the question was, does Share with Wildlife funding work mostly focus on research? And yes, about 70% of our funds in the past 10 years have gone to research. We definitely, you know, every year we do support some education and rehabilitation projects, but they are typically at a smaller dollar value. And we do support some habitat work, but as I mentioned before, a lot of times habitat projects are so much more expensive than the $50,000 cap that we have that it's challenging for an entire project to be completed for that amount. It does happen, and I love talking about habitat projects and opportunities for Share with Wildlife, but that has been a challenge for us.
Okay, thanks. Do you see any other questions in your chat box?
Not at this point. There was just a comment about the Penobscot least chipmunk being a new species. So for that particular attendee, so I appreciate that was new information. That's great.
Okay, thank you. Christine and Dieter, if you would like to check your chat boxes and see if you have any questions.
Doesn't look like I have any. I just have one comment saying thank you.
I had a question about how to treat bamboo, and I didn't send out the message, but wanted to share it. It's bamboo's a lot like privet in the sense that the roots are one of the biggest problems. They spread, and one of the best ways to treat it is to try and contain it. Just keep mowing down around the bamboo to keep it from spreading, and then you can mow it down where you have it already established and treat it with a glyphosate, a foliar treatment, and that will help just kind of kill it. And once again, just keep working on it, keep watching, because it will reestablish itself, but just keep treating it like that.
Okay, thank you. So I don't see any other questions in the chat box at this time. Hang on, let me check this real quick. We did get a comment. I was looking up the weed wrench, but they seem difficult to locate. Get a lot of pot items that I will have to explain later. Okay, so I don't see any other questions. at this time. So if you have a question and we didn't get to it, or you just think of something a little later, please send them to me and I'll be happy to forward them on to our presenters. So with that, thank you, Christine, Dieter, and Jenny for presenting for us today. We really do appreciate it. And thank you for everyone that attended the session. So with that, we will conclude our ITEC conference for this year. Thank you so much, everyone. We really enjoyed it, and we had a lot of great speakers and a lot of great presentations this year. So with that, everyone, thank you and have a good evening, and we'll see everyone next year.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.